The Mediterranean in the mid-2nd century was not merely a sea, it was a curated lake, a silent witness to a world that believed it had finally solved the problem of history. Under the stewardship of the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the Roman Empire had reached a state of equilibrium so profound it was mistaken for permanence. This was the era of the 5 good emperors, a period where the transition of power was governed not by the volatile whims of biology, but the calculated adoption of the most capable man. Driven by this unprecedented political maturity, the machinery of state functioned with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. Every road led to Rome, not merely as a poetic flourish, but as a logistical reality that allowed a decree issued on the Palatine Hill to manifest as a tax levy in Lusitania or a grain shipment in Alexandria within weeks. The spirit of the times was defined by a pervasive sense of inevitability. To a Roman citizen in the year 160, the concept of collapse was not a fear, it was an impossibility, a relic of a primitive past that the light of Mediterranean civilization had permanently extinguished. Yet this very perfection was the architect of its own obsolescence. The system had become so centralized, so optimized for a specific type of internal stability, that it inadvertently stripped away the redundancies necessary to survive a multi-front shock. Consequently, when the first tremors of the coming crisis arrived, they did not appear as a sudden invasion, but as a subtle erosion of the empire's adaptive capacity. The empire was an overtuned instrument, capable of playing a single beautiful melody, but unable to withstand the jarring cacophony of a world that refused to remain static. The administrative burden of maintaining such a vast, intricate lattice of provinces required a level of taxation and bureaucratic oversight that began to choke the very commerce it was designed to protect. Inevitably, the state began to prioritize its own survival over the prosperity of its citizens, transitioning from a commonwealth of participants into a rigid machine of extraction. The forensic evidence of this shift is preserved in the physical record of the era, most notably in the silver denarius. For centuries, the coin had been the bedrock of global trade, its purity a symbol of Roman integrity. However, as the costs of maintaining the frontier rose, the silver content began to plummet. A single coin from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, found in a hoard near the Danube, reveals a microscopic layer of silver wash over a base copper core, a desperate financial deception that signaled the beginning of a terminal inflationary spiral. This was not a localized failure, but a systemic one. The empire was spending more than it could produce to defend borders that were becoming increasingly porous. The psychological impact was devastating. The Roman public, long accustomed to the security provided by a professional military and a stable currency, found themselves living in a world where the fundamental rules of existence were being rewritten by forces beyond their control. In the year 165, this fragility was exposed by the arrival of the Antonine Plague. Returning soldiers from the Parthian campaign brought with them a pathogen, likely smallpox, that tore through the densely packed urban centers of the empire. Galen, the preeminent physician of the age, recorded the symptoms with a detached clinical horror: the blackened skin, the relentless coughing, and the rows of unburied dead. In a small village in the Apennines, an unnamed potter, perhaps 30 years old, watched as his entire family succumbed to the fever in a matter of days. He left behind a single unfinished amphora, its surface marred by a hurried, trembling hand, a silent testament to a life interrupted by a catastrophe the state could neither explain nor prevent. This demographic collapse decimated the tax base and the military recruitment pools, forcing the empire to rely on increasingly desperate measures to fill the ranks. The crisis was compounded by the sudden end of the adoptive succession system. Had Marcus Aurelius chosen a seasoned administrator as his heir, rather than his biological son, Commodus, the institutional memory of the Nerva Antonine era might have endured. Instead, the transition to Commodus in 180 marked the moment where the empire's leadership became decoupled from its needs. The new emperor was not a philosopher-king, but a performer, more interested in the theatrics of the arena than the drudgery of the council chamber. His reign shattered the fragile consensus between the princeps and the Senate, replaced by a climate of paranoia and patronage. The administrative elite, once the guardians of the Pax Romana, were purged or sidelined, replaced by sycophants who viewed the state as a source of personal enrichment rather than a public trust. Driven by this internal rot, the military began to realize that they were the true arbiters of power. On the Germanic frontier, a legionary named Lucius, shivering in the damp cold of a winter watch, understood that his loyalty was no longer to a distant idea of Rome, but to the general who ensured his pay arrived on time. The citizen soldier of the Republic had long since vanished, replaced by a professional class that felt increasingly alienated from the civilian population they were sworn to protect. This alienation created a dangerous feedback loop. As the borders became more dangerous, the army demanded more resources, which required higher taxes, which further impoverished the provinces, leading to civil unrest that required even more military intervention. The empire was no longer a state with an army, it was an army with a state, and the state was failing. The transition from a citizen state to a bureaucratic machine was now complete. The Roman world had become a closed system, unable to process the shifting geopolitical realities of the 3rd century. To the north, the Germanic tribes were no longer disparate bands, but sophisticated confederations. To the east, the Sassanid Persians had replaced the declining Parthians with a revitalized, aggressive central authority. Rome was being squeezed by a pincer movement of history. The rigidity of the Antonine system, which had once been its greatest strength, now prevented it from pivoting to meet these new threats. The empire was a giant with brittle bones, still imposing in stature, but capable of shattering under the slightest impact. Today, the ruins of Roman infrastructure stand as a warning about the limits of optimization. Our modern world, with its lean supply chains and hyper-efficient global networks, mirrors the Roman achievement in its pursuit of a frictionless existence. Yet, as the crisis of the 3rd century demonstrates, a system that cannot account for the unexpected is a system waiting for its own demise. The fragility of perfection lies in its inability to fail gracefully. When the end came for the Pax Romana, it was not because the Romans were weak, but because they had become too successful at being one specific thing. They had built a world so perfect that it had no room left for the messy, adaptive chaos of survival. And when the wind finally changed, the entire structure began to groan under the weight of its own excellence. In the silence of the abandoned villas and the empty forums that followed, the lesson was clear. The cost of absolute stability is often the very resilience required to endure. The Golden Age did not end with a bang, but with the slow, rhythmic sound of a machine grinding itself to pieces. The transition from the philosophical stability of the Antonine era to the iron-fisted pragmatism of the Severan dynasty was not a sudden rupture, but a slow, suffocating tightening of the administrative grip. By the year 193, the Roman air had grown heavy with the scent of wood smoke and wet iron, a tangible shift from the incense-scented halls of the late 2nd century. The death of Commodus had not merely ended a bloodline, it had shattered the fragile illusion that the state could be governed by prestige and tradition alone. Septimius Severus, a man born in the North African city of Lepsis Magna and hardened by the brutal winters of the Danubian frontier, arrived in Rome not as a restorer of the Republic, but as its pragmatic liquidator. He understood a truth that his predecessors had spent centuries trying to politely obscure. The purple robe of the emperor was merely dyed cloth without the steel of the legions to give it weight. When his Danubian soldiers marched into the city, their hobnailed boots striking the marble of the forum with a rhythmic, percussive finality, the Roman social contract was rewritten in the language of raw, coercive power. Driven by the inherent precariousness of his own rise to power, Severus recognized that the traditional sources of legitimacy, the approval of the Senate, and the ancestral lineage of the Julio-Claudians were intellectually and politically bankrupt. Consequently, he turned his gaze toward the only constituency that possessed the physical means to sustain his rule. The spirit of the times was of a profound cynicism. The Roman citizenry had watched the imperial throne be auctioned off to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard, and the sense of civic duty that had once animated the Republic had curdled into a survivalist instinct. Severus leaned into this zeitgeist, systematically dismantling the influence of the senatorial class. He replaced the elite Praetorians, traditionally drawn from the youth of Italy, with his own battle-hardened veterans from the provinces. This was not merely a change in personnel, but a forensic restructuring of the state's heart. The Senate, once the deliberative soul of Rome, found itself relegated to the status of a high-end social club, its members stripped of military commands and replaced by professional soldiers whose only loyalty was to the man who signed their paychecks. Inevitably, this shift from civic merit to military patronage required a staggering amount of capital. To secure the permanent loyalty of the legions, Severus enacted the first significant military pay increase in over a century, raising the annual salary of a legionary from 300 denarii to 450 denarii. This was the moment the Roman legions were transformed from defenders of the state into its primary political stakeholders. To fund this massive expansion of the military budget, Severus was forced to look beyond traditional taxation. He turned to the forensic manipulation of the state's currency. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a sharp decline in the silver content of the denarius, which dropped to below 50% purity. A merchant in a Subura stall, weighing a newly minted coin in his palm, would have felt the literal lightening of the state's credibility. This debasement was a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the emperor's promises and the empire's actual wealth, setting in motion a cycle of inflation that would eventually hollow out the Roman economy. The psychological weight of this transition is best understood through the eyes of a single, unnamed individual caught in the gears of the Severan machine. Consider a 20-year-old recruit from the Metian frontier, perhaps a young man named Gaius, who had grown up in the shadow of a legionary fortress. For him, the Severan pivot was not a political abstraction, but a life-altering elevation. Under the new reforms, Gaius was permitted for the first time to legally marry while in service, allowing his children to be recognized as citizens and heirs. He was no longer a transient guardian of the border, but a settled, privileged member of a new military caste that sat atop the social hierarchy. This personal prosperity, however, came at the cost of the state's collective solvency. The legions were becoming a state within a state, their interests increasingly divorced from the civilian populations they were meant to protect. The fragility of this new order was nearly exposed during the civil war that secured Severus's total control. Had the Battle of Lugdunum in 197 AD unfolded differently, had the rain that morning turned the Gallic soil into a deeper mire, stalling the charge of the Danubian cavalry, the western provinces under Clodius Albinus might have maintained a more traditional, Senate-aligned administration. The slaughter at Lugdunum was one of the largest and most desperate engagements in Roman history, involving nearly 150,000 men. The victory of Severus was not a triumph of a superior ideology, but a victory of superior logistics and ruthless intent.
With the defeat of Albinus, the last credible voice for a balanced, civilian-led government was silenced, and the transition to a mercenary state became inevitable. As Severus's reign progressed, the militarization of the Roman social hierarchy became institutionalized. The annona militaris, a tax in kind specifically designed to feed and clothe the army, became a permanent fixture of the provincial landscape. This was a forensic record of a state that had given up on the complexities of a market economy in favor of a direct command-driven system of extraction. The emperor was no longer the princeps, the first among equals, but the dominus, the master of a household that happened to span 3 continents. The Senate's loss of prestige was absolute. They were now spectators to their own obsolescence, forced to vote for honors for an emperor who openly despised their traditions. This erosion of authority created a vacuum where the only path to the throne was now through the barracks. The culmination of this era was distilled into a single, chilling moment on the emperor's bedfoot in Eboracum, modern-day York, in 211 AD. Addressing his sons, Caracalla and Geta, Severus provided a 3-part directive that would serve as the epitaph for the Roman world of the past and a blueprint for its chaotic future. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and despise all others. This was not the advice of a statesman, but the cold calculation of a warlord. It acknowledged that the empire was no longer a community of citizens bound by law, but a prize to be held by whoever could most effectively bribe the keepers of the gate. The legacy of this pivot is visible in the decades of internal predation that followed, known to history as the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors rose and fell at the whim of their troops. The Severan decision to prioritize the military over the civic body created a structural imbalance that the Roman state would never truly correct. Today, the echoes of this shift remain relevant in any society where the mechanisms of power are decoupled from the consent of the governed and tethered instead to the machinery of force. The transition from a state of laws to a state of swords is a path that, once taken, offers no easy way back to the marble halls of the Republic.
The denarius had long served as the silent ambassador of Roman hegemony, a small disk of near-pure silver that acted as the connective tissue for a civilization stretching from the rain-swept hills of Caledonia to the sun-scorched banks of the Euphrates. For 2 centuries, this currency was the bedrock of global trade, its 95% silver content providing a guarantee of value that transcended local languages and customs. However, by the dawn of the 3rd century, the structural integrity of this fiscal foundation began to fracture under the weight of an unsustainable military budget. Driven by the need to pacify an increasingly volatile and demanding legionary class, the Severan dynasty initiated a series of wage increases that the empire's aging and exhausted silver mines could no longer support. Consequently, the state turned inward, viewing its own currency not as a sacred store of value, but as a malleable tool of short-term survival. This was the beginning of the alchemy of ruin, a desperate campaign of state-sponsored fraud that would eventually dismantle the very economy it sought to preserve. The transition was not a sudden collapse, but a deliberate, incremental betrayal of the public trust. To meet the burgeoning payroll of the legions, imperial mints began to systematically reduce the silver content of the denarius, replacing the precious metal with base copper. Initially, the change was imperceptible to the casual observer, but as the silver purity plummeted from 80% to 50% and finally to less than 5%, the deception became impossible to mask. In the bustling markets of Ephesus and Alexandria, a pervasive sense of ontological insecurity took root, a collective psychological realization that the state was lying to its people. There was a feeling that the very substance of reality was thinning, mirrored by the silver wash that quickly wore off the copper cores of the coins in people's pockets.
This loss of faith was catastrophic. The spirit of the times shifted from one of commercial optimism to a grim, defensive survivalism. The Roman citizen, once a participant in a vibrant Mediterranean marketplace, became a victim of a government that had prioritized the loyalty of the soldier over the solvency of the merchant. The mechanics of this debasement triggered a lethal chain of causality that strangled long-distance trade. As the value of the currency evaporated, prices for basic commodities like grain, oil, and wine began to climb at a rate that defied historical precedent. This hyperinflation was not merely a financial inconvenience, it was a physical barrier that rendered the complex logistics of the empire impossible. Merchants, refusing to accept the increasingly worthless bad money, withdrew their goods from the market or reverted to primitive barter. Consequently, the specialized economies of the provinces, where Gaul produced wine and Egypt produced grain for a common market, collapsed into isolated, self-sufficient pockets. The middle class, whose wealth was stored in the very currency the state was destroying, saw their life savings liquidated in a matter of decades. In this era of forensic decline, we find the archaeological record telling a story of sudden poverty. Hoards of coins from the mid-3rd century are often found discarded in sewers or buried in haste, their oxidized green surfaces revealing the copper fraud that the imperial government had tried to hide beneath a thin silver veneer. Consider the plight of a small-scale olive oil producer in North Africa, a man whose family had prospered for generations under the Pax Romana. He stands in the center of a silent grove, clutching a leather purse filled with the silver of the Emperor Gallienus, knowing that these coins will not buy the iron needed to repair his presses or the salt needed to preserve his harvest. He is the human face of a statistic, a man watching the sophisticated world of his grandfathers dissolve into a landscape of local desperation. Had the imperial administration possessed the foresight to implement a progressive land tax or a more transparent fiscal policy, the reliance on currency manipulation might have been averted, and the middle class might have survived. Instead, the state's choice to debase the coinage created a vacuum where trust once lived. This fiscal disconnect between the capital and the frontiers ensured that the empire was no longer a unified economic zone, but a collection of fortified camps struggling to survive against a rising tide of inflation and external pressure. Inevitably, the central government's inability to collect meaningful taxes in coin led to the rise of a brutal command economy. Since the money was worthless, the state began to demand its taxes in kind, grain, livestock, and forced labor. This transition transformed the relationship between the citizen and the state into one of master and servant. To ensure a steady supply of resources, the imperial bureaucracy enacted laws that bound farmers to their land and sons to their fathers' professions. This was the birth of the colony system, a precursor to medieval serfdom, where the freedom of movement was sacrificed on the altar of fiscal stability. The state-mandated labor was not merely a response to economic decline, it was a desperate attempt to maintain the machinery of war in a world where money had ceased to function. The psychological toll was immense, as the provincial populations grew increasingly alienated from a Rome that now appeared more like a predator than a protector. The fragility of this period is highlighted by the realization that a single different decision regarding military spending could have altered the trajectory of Western history. If the Severan emperors had resisted the urge to double the legionary pay, the silver reserves might have lasted another century, providing the stability needed to weather the barbarian incursions of the late 200s. Instead, the what-if of Roman history is haunted by the image of the mint worker adding copper to the crucible. This decision set in motion a feedback loop of requisition and rebellion that exhausted the empire's internal strength. The legacy of this 3rd century alchemy is still visible in the social structures of the modern world, as the shift from a free market citizenry to a localized, land-bound peasantry laid the foundations for the feudalism of the Middle Ages. The shadows of this ruin remind us that the collapse of a civilization often begins not with the crashing of gates, but with the quiet, fraudulent strike of a hammer in the imperial mint, turning the bedrock of an empire into a pocketful of tarnished copper.
The year 260 AD functioned as a tectonic shift in the Roman consciousness, a moment where the physical boundaries of the state were finally outmatched by the psychological collapse of its central authority. Driven by the catastrophic capture of Emperor Valerian at the Battle of Edessa, the Roman world was forced to confront a reality previously unthinkable. The living god of the Mediterranean had been reduced to a footstool for the Sassanid king Shapur I. This was not merely the loss of a commander or a legion, it was the evaporation of the imperial contract. For centuries, the provinces had traded their autonomy for the promise of security, a bargain that had transformed the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. When news of Valerian's humiliation reached the Rhine and the Euphrates, the silence that followed was not of mourning, but of calculation. The collective psychological state of the era was one of profound abandonment, as local elites realized that the distant city on the Tiber was no longer a shield, but a weight. Inevitably, the instinct for survival superseded the tradition of loyalty, leading to the fragmentation of the imperial soul into 3 distinct, competing visions of Romanitas. In the West, the catalyst for secession was the sheer physical distance between the crisis and the cure. The Rhine frontier, long the site of grueling attrition, had become a sieve through which Germanic tribes poured with increasing impunity. Marcus Cassianus Latinus Postumus, a man whose career had been forged in the damp, claustrophobic forts of the northern border, recognized that the central government under Valerian's son Gallienus was too preoccupied with the Italian heartland to prioritize the safety of Gaul, Britain, or Spain. Consequently, Postumus orchestrated a coup that was less an act of rebellion and more a regional reorganization of resources. He did not claim to be a barbarian king, rather he styled himself as the true restorer of Gaul, minting coins in the workshops of Trier that featured his own stern, bearded profile alongside the goddess Victoria. These silver Antoninii, found in modern-day hoards buried beneath the vineyards of the Moselle, serve as forensic evidence of a functioning, parallel Roman state. The Gallic Empire maintained its own senate, its own praetorian guard, and its own bureaucracy, proving that the Roman model could survive even if the Roman center could not. The human cost of this transition is perhaps best understood through the eyes of an anonymous mint worker in Augusta Treverum, whose hands were stained with the industrial grime of a breakaway economy. This man, who had spent decades striking the likeness of distant, soft emperors in Rome, now found himself carving the features of a local general who actually walked the streets of his city. For him, the Gallic Empire was not a political abstraction, but a stabilizing force that ensured the grain shipments arrived and the Germanic raids were kept at a distance. His reality was defined by the rhythmic clang of the hammer, a sound that signaled a hard-won, local peace. Had Postumus chosen to march on Rome in those early months of 260 AD, he might have unified the empire under his own banner. But his decision to remain in the north reflects the new defensive priority of the age. He was content to hold the Rhine, leaving the rest of the world to its fate. This containment strategy preserved the West, but it simultaneously severed the cultural and economic arteries that at once bound the Atlantic to the Adriatic. In the East, the fragmentation took a more sophisticated and ultimately more dangerous form. The city of Palmyra,
An oasis of marble and palm trees rising from the Syrian desert had long served as the vital hinge between Rome and the Silk Road. Driven by the vacuum left by Valerian's defeat, the Palmyrene aristocrat Septimius Odenathus took it upon himself to check the Sassanid advance. His success was so total that he became the de facto ruler of the East, a position inherited by his widow, Zenobia, upon his assassination. Zenobia was a figure of immense intellectual and political ambition, who saw in the chaos of the 3rd century an opportunity to forge a hybrid empire that blended Roman administrative discipline with Eastern dynastic power. Under her rule, Palmyra was no longer a client state, but a rival capital. The atmosphere in the East was a vibrant, albeit precarious independence, as the wealth of the spice trade was redirected from the Roman treasury into the fortification of Syrian cities. The fragility of this arrangement was exposed by a single, overlooked logistical detail: the grain supply of Egypt. In 270 AD, Zenobia's forces seized Alexandria, a move that directly threatened the breadbasket of Rome itself. This was the point of no return. Inevitably, the central government could tolerate a breakaway state in the desert, but it could not tolerate the starvation of the capital. The psychological impact of this eastern secession was profound, as it forced the Roman population to realize that their survival was now dependent on the whims of a desert queen who claimed descent from Cleopatra. The unified Mediterranean identity, which for centuries had allowed a merchant from Carthage to feel at home in Ephesus, was being replaced by a series of fortified camps. The world was shrinking, and with it, the Roman imagination. The capture of Valerian remained the open wound that refused to heal, a forensic anchor for the era's despair. Reports filtered back to Rome of the former emperor being used as a mounting block for Shapur's horse, his skin eventually flayed and dyed vermilion to be hung in a Persian temple. This gruesome detail, recorded by the historian Lactantius, served as a constant reminder of the state's impotence. The spirit of the times was characterized by a desperate search for divine favor, leading to the rise of mystery cults and a hardening of religious lines. If the emperor could be flayed, then the gods themselves must be angry. Consequently, the fragmentation of the empire was not just a matter of maps and armies, but of faith. People looked to local saviors because the universal ones had failed them. The legacy of this period remains etched into the very geography of the modern world. The division of the empire into regional power bases under Postumus and Zenobia prefigured the permanent split between the Latin West and the Greek East that would define the Middle Ages. The logic of the 3rd century, that local problems require local solutions, eventually eroded the concept of a singular, global superpower. Today, as we see the resurgence of regionalism and the fraying of international alliances, the echoes of the Gallic and Palmyrene secessions resonate with a chilling familiarity. The fragmentation of the imperial soul was not a sudden break, but a slow, logical withdrawal into the familiar. It was the moment that the world decided that a small, defensible reality was preferable to a grand, crumbling dream. The walls built in that era, both of stone and of the mind, would stand for 1,000 years, defining the limits of what it meant to be civilized in a world that had forgotten how to be one.
By the year 268, the Roman world was not merely dying, it was dissolving. The psychological weight of 5 decades of civil war, plague, and systemic economic collapse had produced a collective paralysis, a sense that the Pax Romana was a fever dream told by grandfathers who no longer existed. Rome was no longer a city of triumphs, it was a city of waiting, a population conditioned to watch the northern horizon for the smoke of burning villas.
This was a world where the currency had lost 95% of its silver content, where a loaf of bread cost a week's wages, and where the gods seemed to have turned their faces away from the Mediterranean. Driven by the absolute failure of the traditional senatorial class to secure the borders, power drifted toward the Danubian frontier. Here, in the harsh provinces of Illyricum, a new breed of man was being forged in the relentless crucible of border skirmishes. These were not men of the library or the forum, but of the camp and the forced march. They were the Illyriciani, professional soldiers who viewed the empire not as a political ideal, but as a series of logistical problems to be solved through violence and discipline. Claudius Gothicus was the first true manifestation of this shift, a man whose rise to the purple signaled that the era of the aristocratic amateur was over. His victory at Naissus in 269 was not a matter of tactical brilliance alone, but of a desperate, grinding efficiency that utilized the Roman infantry's last remaining vestiges of discipline against a Gothic horde that had grown overconfident. The fragility of this moment cannot be overstated. Had the Gothic wagon lagger held for just 2 more hours, the Roman lines, brittle and underfed, would have likely shattered, leaving the Italian heartland open to a slaughter from which it would never have recovered. A surviving letter from a low-ranking administrative clerk in Mediolanum, written during the height of the Gothic panic, describes the sound of the city's blacksmiths working through the night to sharpen rusted blades, a forensic echo of a society that realized it was one lost battle away from extinction. When Aurelian took the throne in 270, he inherited a map that was more holes than fabric. To the east, the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia had severed the grain routes of Egypt. To the west, the Gallic Empire maintained its own courts and legions, indifferent to the fate of the capital. Aurelian understood that an empire cannot be held by steel alone. It requires the relentless logic of supply lines. He was a man of the ledger as much as the sword. Driven by the necessity of a total war footing, he reorganized the grain doles and stabilized the mints, but his primary focus was the kinetic reunification of the fractured provinces. He moved with a speed that baffled his contemporaries, marching his legions across the Anatolian plateau in the height of summer. In the dust of the Syrian desert, a centurion named Marcus, who had transitioned from the damp forests of the Rhine to the blistering heat of Emesa, echoes the exhaustion of the age. He did not fight for Roman virtue or the Senate. He fought because the Illyrian emperors were the first in his lifetime who actually paid him in coin that did not crumble, and who provided the bread necessary to survive another week of sand and blood. The campaign against Zenobia was a masterpiece of rapid maneuvers and psychological warfare. Aurelian did not seek to merely defeat the Palmyrenes. He sought to erase the possibility of their independence. Consequently, after the fall of Palmyra, the city was treated with a cold, pragmatic brutality as a warning to any other provincial governor with royal ambitions. With the east secured, Aurelian turned his gaze towards the Gallic Empire. The inevitable clash at the Battle of Chalons in 274 was less a traditional battle and more a judicial execution of the separatist movement. Tetricus, the Gallic emperor, supposedly surrendered before the fighting even reached its peak, realizing that the professionalized, battle-hardened legions of the Danube were a force that the local Gallic militias could never hope to withstand. The reunification was complete, and for a brief moment, the map of the Mediterranean was once again painted in a single, unbroken color. However, this restoration required the transformation of Rome itself. The construction of the Aurelian walls, beginning in 271, marked the end of an era of imperial confidence. For centuries, Rome was an open city, its security guaranteed by the distance of its frontiers. Now the frontier was everywhere. The brickwork, much of which was scavenged from older monuments, tombs, and even private homes, serves as a forensic record of a society cannibalizing its past to protect its future. The speed of construction, 12 miles of fortification completed in just a few years, speaks to the desperate psychological state of the capital. Every citizen, from the highest senator to the lowest laborer, was pressed into service or forced to watch as their neighborhoods were bisected by towering walls of brick and concrete. It was a physical admission that the world was no longer safe and that the center could no longer hold without armor. To provide a spiritual scaffold for this new military autocracy, Aurelian introduced the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This was a calculated political maneuver designed to replace the fragmented, localized paganism of the provinces with a singular, unassailable focal point of devotion. The sun was a god for the soldier, visible, powerful, and indifferent to the nuances of Greek philosophy. It mirrored the emperor himself, a single, blinding source of authority that moved across the world with predictable, unstoppable force. This religious shift was not merely a matter of personal faith, but a tool of unification, creating a shared identity for the diverse ethnic groups that made up the Roman military. The gold medallions struck during this period, showing Aurelian crowned with the solar rays, were not just currency, they were propaganda, reinforcing the idea that the emperor was the earthly representative of a cosmic order that had finally returned to restore balance. The Illyrian restoration saved the empire from immediate dissolution, but it did so by killing the old world to make room for the new. The Republic was a ghost, and the Principate was a memory. In their place stood the Dominate, a rigid, militarized state where the emperor was no longer a first citizen, but a lord. The legacy of this era is etched into the very topography of modern Rome, where the massive brick circuits of the Aurelian walls still dictate the flow of traffic and the boundaries of the historic center. They remain a silent, towering testament to the moment the world's greatest power decided that its only hope for survival was to hide behind a wall, a decision that would define the defensive posture of European civilization for the next 1,000 years. The restoration was a success, but it was a success of the fortress, not the forum.
By the year 284, the Mediterranean world was defined by a profound and pervasive psychic exhaustion. For 5 decades, the Roman Empire had not functioned as a state, but as a series of overlapping catastrophes, where the average reign of an emperor was measured in months, and the value of the silver denarius had plummeted until it was little more than a bronze coin washed in a thin, deceptive layer of tin. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a period that had shattered the classical confidence of the Pax Romana and replaced it with a desperate, localized survivalism. The Roman citizen of this era did not look to the horizon with the expectation of trade or expansion, but with a paralyzing fear of the next provincial governor to declare himself Augustus, bringing another army of starving legionaries to forage through their fields. Driven by this relentless instability, the collective consciousness of the empire underwent a fundamental shift. The people were no longer seeking a leader who represented their interests, but a master who could guarantee their existence. It was into this atmosphere of total systemic failure that a soldier from Dalmatia named Diocles, later known to history as Diocletian, emerged to seize the throne. Diocletian understood with cold, forensic clarity that the empire's collapse was not merely a matter of bad luck or external pressure, but a failure of geometry. The Roman world was simply too vast to be governed by a single man from a single center. Consequently, he initiated a series of reforms that would dismantle the last vestiges of the Augustan Principate, the 400-year-old fiction that the emperor was merely the first citizen of a restored republic.
In its place, Diocletian erected the dominate. The transition was not merely administrative, it was theatrical and psychological. The emperor was no longer a magistrate in a toga, but a dominus, a lord and god who resided behind layers of court ritual borrowed from the Sassanid East. To see him, one had to perform proskynesis, prostrating oneself on the floor in a display of total submission. This was a calculated response to the era of military anarchy. By elevating the emperor to a semi-divine status, Diocletian sought to make the very act of rebellion feel like sacrilege. The state was no longer a partnership between the Senate and the people. It was a hierarchy of power descending from a single, unapproachable source. To solve the geographic problem of the empire's scale, Diocletian implemented the tetrarchy, or the rule of four. He divided the Roman world into two halves, east and west, each governed by an Augustus, who was in turn assisted by a Caesar, or junior emperor. This was intended to ensure that an imperial presence was always close to the frontiers, capable of responding to a Gothic incursion or a Persian raid without waiting months for orders from Rome. Inevitably, this doubling and then quadrupling of the imperial court required a massive expansion of the bureaucracy. The empire was carved into smaller provinces, which were then grouped into dioceses, creating a dense web of administrators, tax collectors, and secret police known as the agents in rebus. A surviving document from this period, a tax assessment from a village in Roman Egypt, lists every single vine, every head of cattle, and every slave with a terrifying precision that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The state was no longer a distant protector, it was an omnipresent accountant. The cost of this stability was a crushing economic burden that transformed the social fabric of the empire. To fund the expanded army, now reorganized into mobile comitatenses and frontier liminatani, and the burgeoning bureaucracy, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301. This was an attempt to halt the runaway inflation that had rendered the currency worthless, setting fixed prices for everything from a bushel of wheat to the fee for a lawyer's services. When the edict failed to curb the market's volatility, the state responded with even more rigid controls. Because the tax base was shrinking due to plague and war, the government decreed that certain professions were now hereditary. A baker's son was legally bound to remain a baker. A soldier's son was born into the legion. This marks the birth of the medieval mindset, where an individual's destiny was not determined by their talent or ambition, but their birthright and their obligation to the state's survival. In a small, wind-swept villa in the province of Gaul, a minor local official named Claudius finds himself trapped in this new reality. As a curallus, or city councilor, he is now personally liable for any shortfall in the imperial tax quota for his district. If the harvest fails or the peasants flee, the state will seize his family's land and wealth to make up the difference. He lives in a state of quiet, constant terror, watching the horizon not for barbarians, but for the imperial inspectors who represent the very system he serves. His life is a microcosm of the dominate. He is safe from the chaos of the previous century, but he is a prisoner of the order that replaced it. The classical ideal of the politus, the citizen who participates in the life of the city, is dead, replaced by the subject, whose primary function is to serve the machinery of the empire. Had Diocletian not been possessed of such a singular, obsessive will to organize, the empire might have fragmented into a dozen warring kingdoms by the year 300. His retirement in 305 to a massive, fortress-like palace in Split was a moment of profound fragility for the Roman world. It was a rare instance where a single man's decision to step away from power could have triggered an immediate return to anarchy. While his tetrarchy eventually collapsed into civil war between his successors, the administrative and psychological structures he built remained. He had successfully decoupled the survival of the empire from the survival of the individual emperor. The Roman state was now an institution that could function even if its leaders were mediocre, provided the bureaucracy continued to collect the grain and the army continued to man the walls. The legacy of Diocletian's dominate is written into the very geography of the modern world. His decision to formalize the division between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West created a cultural and political fault line that persisted through the Middle Ages and into the modern era, prefiguring the eventual split between the Byzantine and Holy Roman empires. The rigid hierarchical society he forged, which sacrificed liberty for the sake of security, became the blueprint for the feudal systems that would emerge after the final collapse of the Western administration. Today, the ruins of his palace at Split are not a museum, but a living part of a modern city, with shops and homes built into the very walls that once housed the man who ended the classical world. The price of survival was the soul of the Republic, and Diocletian paid it without hesitation.